Hello, my name is Tara Sklar. I'm a professor of health law here at the University of Arizona at James E. Rogers College of Law. It is my pleasure to speak with Shefali Macharik Desai, who heads up our worker rights clinic here at the University of Arizona. And our topic today is called The Other Front Line, Immigrant Workers' Rights, Fears, and Public Health Consequences. So to begin, Professor Macharik Desai, could you just let us know what you do and what you see here at the Worker Rights Clinic in Arizona?
Yeah, hi. It's so nice to be talking with you today about these issues because they're really salient right now. So what we do at the Workers' Rights Clinic is we train law students to become the next generation of lawyers. And we do that by representing low-wage immigrant workers. And when I say immigrant worker, I'm really talking about a large group of people that include both people with documented status and people who don't have documented status. But what ties all of these people together is that they are our essential frontline workers in this pandemic. And they are hourly workers. For the most part, they are low-wage workers, and they're the most vulnerable right now, and we're really seeing that. I saw a statistic that said that there are an estimated 6 million immigrant workers right now in the industries that we see as frontline essential worker industries.
Right, and these industries vary. I would say they're all on the front lines. Could you describe in some more detail the types of jobs that these individuals work in?
Absolutely. So lots of immigrant workers are in agriculture. So think fruits, vegetables, but also we're looking at ranches, beef production, pork production, also in the food services industry. So that's everything from food processing plants, think poultry processing plants, to grocery, to the delivery of those groceries, which more and more of us are accessing now. And then, of course, you also see a lot of immigrant workers in healthcare. And this covers everyone from hospital workers, but also janitorial staff in institutions, in healthcare institutions, and nursing homes, which is something we see a lot of at our clinic. We see people who are working at smaller nursing homes and nursing care facilities and home health care facilities.
Right. So just a really broad range. I think what might be very helpful for our audience is to maybe hear an example of an individual that you see in the healthcare sector, because that is and prominently in the news right now, and what they might face if they're exposed to the coronavirus.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that, because a couple of weeks into the pandemic, I received an email from a worker. So she's an immigrant worker, she works at a hospital, and she's a food services worker. So she works in the cafeteria of the hospital. And she was told to take food into a patient's room, and that's what she did. She was not provided with any protective equipment. She wasn't told anything other than you need to go take the food to the patient. Well, it wasn't until she had been in the room that she realized that this was actually a confirmed COVID patient. She, of course, immediately was worried about her own safety because she hadn't had any protective equipment when she went in there. So she asked her supervisor, she said, I think I've been exposed. What should I do? I've looked, and the CDC guidelines seem to say that I should quarantine for 14 days. And at first her supervisor was against any type of, that she should stay away from work at all. And then eventually it turned out that the supervisor said, well, you can take 5 days. And this worker was understandably terrified, not only for herself, but for the health of her family, but also for her continued job prospects, because she needs that paycheck in order to put food on her family's table and in order to keep a roof over their heads. And so this was the first person who had come to our clinic saying, what rights do I have? What can I ask for? What should I be doing? And by the way, I don't want to spread this either. So by continuing to go to work, which I have to do in order to make economic ends meet for my family, I also don't want to spread it. And so here's this very conscientious person who's in a bind. And I can tell you about kind of the cascading effects that we're seeing now, both at our clinic, but also nationwide with low-wage immigrant workers. And it's this domino effect that starts with what's going on in the workplace, moves to whether or not people have access or the ability to ask for paid leaves if they are in fact infected. And then finally to what happens when they lose their jobs. And of course, we're seeing people losing their jobs, especially in low wage sectors, everywhere right now.
Right. So I think what would be really helpful is to go through what some of these rights are that immigrant workers do have access to, and the legal authorities in which they can claim the right to paid sick leave, the right to better resources. Could you describe some of those legal agencies as well as some of the laws?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with this particular immigrant story, right? So she's in her workplace. She's wondering what she can ask for in terms of protective equipment, in terms of time off. So first, I'm going to talk about the health and safety standards. So the OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is a sub-agency of the Department of Labor. These are federal agencies that are tasked and charged with ensuring worker health and safety in the workplace. And that's what OSHA does. Now, OSHA, and I just checked before we had our conversation, has still not promulgated any enforceable rules or regulations around safety in the workplace with respect to COVID. So they have lots of rules and regulations and laws that they enforce with respect to how to have a safe workplace, but they don't have that for COVID. What they have, the closest regulation they have has to do with bloodborne pathogens. But we all know that doesn't work for COVID because COVID's not limited to blood, right? It's in the air. And so there's been a call amongst many attorneys who are advocates for low-wage workers and immigrant workers saying, please give employers a really clear directive about what it is they need to do. But OSHA has so far resisted that request, and there's a real lack of clarity around what employers have to do. The guidelines, they have promulgated guidelines, but the guidelines are very open and they leave it to individual employers to determine whether or not there are hazards in the workplace, what safety measures that they think they need to take. They tell employers, go ahead and evaluate the risk exposure that your employees might have. And then they do make recommendations, right? They say sometimes you might have to have physical barriers. Sometimes you might have to provide protective equipment like masks, like face masks. You should encourage proper hygiene. You should clean tools that multiple people are using. But at the end of the day, none of this is an actual directive. And their OSHA website says very clearly in the same place where it has its guidelines that these are not legally binding and they are not legally enforceable. So what that means for the rights of a worker in the workplace is, and the guidelines also say to employers, encourage your employees to contact us if they're concerned, if they're worried that their health and safety with respect to COVID is not being taken into account. But because these are not legally enforceable, what we're hearing from many immigrant workers who, again, can't risk losing that paycheck is they don't feel safe contacting OSHA because they're worried that if it becomes known that they were the person who did this, or if they ask their employers questions about it, that they might get retaliated against, which means essentially that they might get terminated for raising these issues. There are provisions that OSHA can enforce with respect to retaliation, but prior to the pandemic, it would sometimes take up to a year to resolve those claims. And I'm imagining that those timelines are probably even longer now. So that's not immediate relief for workers. If they need the paycheck now, they can't wait. So that's the health and safety kind of component. All right, so I talked a little bit earlier about that cascading effect. And what I mean by that is, all right, say you do get sick from being at work, okay, and you want to do the right thing and you want to, or even if you're exposed, you want to do the right thing and you want to quarantine. Maybe your doctor tells you that you need to quarantine. Maybe you have a family member who's sick that you need to take care of. So that's why the federal government recently passed the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, the FFCRA. And what this act does is it provides for up to 2 weeks of emergency paid sick leave for workers. And then it also amends the Family and Medical Leave Act, the FMLA, to add additional 12 weeks after that. Actually, it's 10 weeks after that of extended paid leave. But let me kind of break down those two laws. So on the first law, the emergency paid sick leave, I mean, that's if you're quarantining, if you're sick with COVID, or if you're taking care of someone with COVID. The problem, however, for a lot of the workers we see, the low-wage immigrant workers, is we're not sure how it's going to be applied as to undocumented workers. The act itself does not distinguish between someone who has documentation or who doesn't. Mm-hmm. There were versions of the bill that were explicit that it did cover all workers, but those versions didn't pass. So it's just sort of an unknown quantity. And the reason why it's unknown is that employers are going to be reimbursed for these emergency paid sick leave expenses. So when they have to pay someone who's not there, they get reimbursed through the federal government. But in order to do that, they're going to have to provide the federal government with information about the worker who is sick. And it's unclear whether if you're paying someone off the books, if an employer is paying someone off the books, are they going to feel comfortable going through that process, or instead are they just going to deny that leave to somebody who's being paid off the books? So that's one concern. The second concern is the same as what I discussed under OSHA, the retaliation concern. So again, just like with OSHA, the FFCRA does have a retaliation provision that says, hey, employers, if somebody asks for this or somebody takes this leave, you can't retaliate against them. You can't fire them for that. However, there's a very high standard that workers have to meet in order to show that, much higher than in other employment and labor laws, actually. And again, you have this issue of, okay, so you can file a complaint for retaliation. You might even file a lawsuit if you can find a lawyer to file a lawsuit for you for retaliation. That's going to take months or years to resolve. These are people who aren't even going to ask for the paid sick leave if they have an inkling that they're going to get terminated because of it, because remedies on the back end are not going to be enough for them. I also want to address briefly the extension of the Family Medical Leave Act, where people have additional 10 weeks after. So we've got 2 weeks under the emergency paid sick time. Now they can have another 10 weeks of paid leave. But what's important here is that leave, that extended leave, paid leave, is only to care for a child whose school has closed down. So it is not if you're not well in 2 weeks, then there is no paid leave for you just because you're sick or because you're taking care of someone who's sick.
Most of the efforts you've talked about so far have been federal efforts, but we do know how what's happening in the states is that very much governors and mayors are taking the lead on this issue across the board. So it'd be great to hear about any efforts happening within the states, perhaps within our own state of Arizona.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that question. We actually happen to be one of the few states that already had a robust paid sick leave law. And it's a great law. It's an earned paid sick time law. So in Arizona, if you're a worker, any kind of worker, it doesn't matter, part-time, full-time, whatever. If you're an employee, for every 30 hours worked, you earn 1 hour paid sick time. And you can accumulate that. And in one calendar year, you can use between 3 days worth or 5 days worth of that earned paid sick time that you've earned and accumulated, depending on how many employees your employer has. So if your employer has fewer than 15 employees, you only get a total of 3 days. If it's more than 15, then you get a total of 5 days of paid sick leave. And our law actually had a provision for emergency situations that might cause a shutdown of a school. So you can use that paid sick leave if you're sick, you're taking care of a family member who's sick, or you're taking care of a child whose school has closed down for these types of reasons. And that leave can be taken in addition to the federal emergency paid sick leave. But again, so I'll tell you what we see in our clinic. We actually get a lot of cases of low-wage immigrant workers who come to us, and they come to us for other reasons, wage theft issues, for example. They're not getting paid the minimum wage, they're not getting paid overtime. But almost every single time when we ask them if they've been sick and if they've had to take time off to take care of a sick child, and whether they were paid for that time, they say no. They say, I didn't know I even had that right. So what's so interesting is that most workers that we come into contact with, these frontline low-wage workers, they don't know they have a right to this paid leave. And in most of the time, their employers don't know either. And so there's a whole lot more, I think, that can be done around education with respect to our state law so that people know they have access to it. And I can save this for later, but there are also things that our state agency that's in charge of enforcing this law can do. And again, just like with the federal laws, the biggest concern that low-wage immigrant workers have with respect to accessing this law is they don't want to get retaliated against. And our law has a very robust retaliation provision. It says that if an employer retaliates, they are going to be on the hook for, at a minimum, $150 a day for that violation until that violation is cured or there's a court judgment on that issue. But even so, many of our workers don't want to ask for that because they're worried that means they're going to be out of work.
Right. And in the Arizona state law, what is the eligibility requirement? Is it for all workers, or how is it stated?
It's very broad. Any worker, any employee, so you have to be classified as an employee, not an independent contractor, for example. But if you are an employee in the state of Arizona, you have access to that earned paid sick time law.
Right. So we're learning here with this pandemic and all these different measures that are being put in place, these emergency measures from the federal and state governments, they don't always apply if you are undocumented, even though you could be very much working for some of these frontline groups. So could we now speak to that in terms of the actual, what you would have access to if you're an immigrant worker, and then knowing that if you're undocumented versus documented, or if you're, which is a common situation, you might be here legally, but you could be living with a loved one in your household who is not. And just to get a sense of how people are able to or not able to access unemployment benefits, small business loans, those types of resources.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to clarify that as far as we know, every worker, whether they're documented or not documented, they're eligible for the paid sick time that has been passed by the federal government, but we just don't know how it's going to be implemented. And it's the same thing with Arizona's paid sick time law. Documentation status does not matter. And that's true actually for all the labor laws that you see in this country. And that's for a very important reason, which is you don't want to create a situation where employers have an incentive to treat certain workers without those benefits because that's more affordable for the employer, right? That actually creates a perverse incentive for employers to not hire documented workers. Does that make sense? But the concern happens is that when you do have, and this will get to your question, when you have folks who are not documented, they're less likely to ask for those benefits that the law covers. The law is covering them, but they don't want to ask for it because not only might they lose their jobs, which, there's an economic sensitivity there, but now they're also worried about immigration enforcement, for example. And this addresses your question of, look, the person might actually be documented, but I think it's something like 500,000 people in Arizona live in a mixed status household. And there are lots, in that number, there's lots of U.S. citizen children who are living in undocumented or in a household where there's one undocumented person. So sometimes even a documented immigrant worker doesn't want to ask for these things because they're worried that they might somehow get into a situation where the undocumented members of their household are going to be negatively affected. So you also asked about unemployment insurance and some of these other benefits. So if you have somebody who doesn't feel safe in their workplace, maybe gets ill in their workplace, then they can't have access to these paid leaves, or they do and the paid leaves run out. Okay, now what? Now they're potentially out of a job. Let's say they're out of a job. One of the big stimulus packages that was passed was the CARES Act. That it increased unemployment insurance benefits by $600 a week in every state. Now, this is only until the end of July. Well, if somebody is not documented, they have zero access to that unemployment insurance. You can't apply for unemployment insurance benefits unless you have what's called work authorization. And you actually have to have that work authorization in 3 different time periods. So there are also folks who might have documented status, but they don't have the work authorization for that entire period of time. And they also will be denied unemployment insurance benefits. There were also the rebate stimulus checks. That was another big part of this for workers. That is also something that many immigrant families are not going to be able to access. Again, even documented workers may not have access to that. U.S. citizen children may not have access to that because if the person who filed taxes filed under an ITIN, individual taxpayer ID number instead of a social security number, then even if that person was paying taxes, and in fact, many immigrants with ITINs, I mean, they're paying billions in taxes every year as an aggregate whole. They still will not have access to those stimulus checks. So, and if you don't have documentation or you don't have anyone, then you're definitely not getting those stimulus checks. So no unemployment insurance, no stimulus checks, also no free testing for COVID or healthcare for COVID if you are undocumented. And again, here, even for immigrants who are documented and do have eligibility for some of those free Medicaid programs, they might be afraid to access them both because of potential public charge implications, even though the government has says they're not going to apply the public charge analysis. People might just be too afraid or not understand that. And also because they may be afraid to go places for fear of immigration enforcement if they do live in mixed status households. And again, the federal government has said, the Department of Homeland Security said, we are not going to enforce immigration in these sensitive locations, hospitals, clinics, urgent cares, but they haven't said they're freezing all enforcement efforts. So people might still be worried about whether or not this is something that they feel safe accessing right now.
Sure, and I think it's important to note that they may not feel safe accessing it, even if they may have symptoms that could be the coronavirus, that they could very well have other common symptoms related to chronic conditions and not getting treatment there either, just because it's such an uncertain time in terms of what they could have access to, what they might be exposing themselves to. The safety net is so minimal that they can't, any additional risk beyond what they have to do for their jobs, they would be less likely to want to undertake. This is very helpful. I'd like to move on to these fear issues that you're already tapping into, and we've discussed them a little bit in terms of what this means to lose potential income, and then retaliation. Should an employer take it against that individual for asking for paid sick leave or other protections? Would you like to address these any more in terms of potential fear of deportation or any other health and safety concerns?
I think in the pandemic, been a great deal of fear in immigrant communities. And that's true for immigrants who are documented and live in mixed status households. And it's true for immigrants who are not documented. And what we're seeing very much with the clinic, clients coming through the clinic or calling on our workers hotline, is that this fear is magnified and exacerbated because now there's a fear of becoming ill, not being able to access healthcare, and not even wanting to attempt to take time off of work or access healthcare for fear of losing income, for fear of being labeled as a public charge for those people who may be documented but want to at some point adjust their status, and also for what that might mean for loved ones who could potentially get pulled into the immigration enforcement dragnet. So I think I've said all of those things already, but to emphasize it, the fear is just magnified in all of the immigrant communities. And so you already had immigrant workers reluctant to advocate for their rights, and now they're even more so reluctant to do that.
Sure. And then with that fear, becomes serious public health consequences when we can't in any way provide for a very large population to help them to test for if they possibly have the coronavirus, to treat them. But there's a particular issue with this population in terms of them being at the front line and having such a higher risk to exposure. Would you like to address some of those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've been thinking about this, these are frontline workers. These are workers who can't lose their paychecks. These are workers who many of them don't have any health care at all, or they have, really underinsured in terms of healthcare insurance. And this is not just, in my mind, this is not just about ensuring their health, safety, and economic survival, although it's very much that. It's about the rest of us. It's about all of us who are really depending on them to continue in these frontline industries. And I'll give you an example of the nursing homes. So we've seen already all across the country that this is a hotbed of where the virus not only spreads quickly, but also is the most fatal because of the demographic that's typically in the nursing homes, right? So many of the clients who come through the clinic are aid workers in these nursing homes, janitorial staff, food services staff in these nursing homes. And they already, before the pandemic, when they were falling ill or when their children were ill, they would still go into work. So they were too afraid, or they didn't know about asking for the paid sick leave that they already had under Arizona law. And this is now just blossoming. We have several clients in the clinic right now who work for these smaller nursing care home facilities. They're not being provided with any protective equipment to go into work, and they're going into work. We're all teleworking. I'm teleworking. My students in the clinic are teleworking. Our clients are not. So, for example, when we need to get a hold of our clients, we have to think, oh, we have to wait until 5:30 or 6 o'clock tonight, because then they're off their shift. So they're going into those nursing homes every day. And if they're not feeling well, they feel like they need to keep going into work until they absolutely can't, because otherwise they'll just be terminated, because the feeling amongst some of these employers is, many of these employers, unfortunately, is we'll just hire the next person, who's in line for this job.
What would you say are some of the priority recommendations in terms of where we can begin to really talk about immigrants' rights right now in COVID-19, but perhaps beyond then as well?
Yeah, and I would even frame it kind of more largely as low-wage worker rights in general, and then immigrants, come under those same protections. And I think the biggest thing we can address right now is that we need to adequately resource the agencies, our federal and state agencies that are tasked with creating, implementing, and enforcing these rights. So we need to make sure that OSHA has the resources it needs to create these rules, but not just to create them, but then to educate employers about them, assist employers in implementing them, and enforce them when employers aren't doing what they need to be doing. Same thing with the Department of Labor under the paid leaves, and the state of Arizona has its equivalent of the Department of Labor, which is called the Industrial Commission of Arizona. They need to be doing those same things with respect to making sure employers are not turning people away when they ask for that paid sick leave, that they're providing the paid sick leave, and that if they're retaliating, employers understand that there's going to be swift action by those agencies to ensure that workers are not being unlawfully terminated for asking, just for asking for the rights that they're already entitled to.
No, that's great. That's very helpful. Where can we go for more information on these issues?
So there are many government websites that provide information. The OSHA guidelines that I discussed is on OSHA's website. Explanation of the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act is on the Department of Labor's website. The organizations that I found most helpful for workers has been the National Employment Law Project. They actually have an entire section that addresses the intersection between low-wage worker rights and immigration and immigrant rights, because that interaction can be sometimes a little bit different. And then the other website that does that really well is the National Immigration Law Center. So NELP and NILC are the two acronyms, and they have wonderful FAQs on their websites that address all of the questions about which law applies to whom and when and under what conditions. And I've also created a fact sheet that's specific to Arizona workers, and that can be found on our Workers' Rights Clinic website.
That's great. Yeah, we'll have all that information posted, and individuals, whether for themselves or for somebody else, could reach out to you at that website for more information, questions.
Yes,
very,
and
very helpful.
let me mention that all of these places, including our website, has this information in English and in Spanish.
Oh, great. Well, it was an absolute pleasure to speak with you today on these issues. And I thank you for your time. Thank you for addressing them in such a proactive way.
Thank you. Thanks for asking about them.